here this weekend, so I'll do the honors and try to do them justice. Welcome, Voltron fans, to VoltCon 2022. And with that,
thank you. For those of you who don't know who I am, my name is Shannon Muir, and it's a small enough room I don't think I need my long-range glasses, so I'm going to take them off. A lot of people best know me from my initial forays into the early internet fandom. I was one of the first people to put a site devoted to Voltron. One of the parts of that was my theory based on certain hints that were dropped in the show of how the star map likely was. And at a certain point, World Events Productions contacted me. They were redoing their site in conjunction with Voltron The Third Dimension and said, we'd like to partner with you to make this our official star map, which has always been a bit of an honor for me. If you've read my bio in the program, because of the inspiration that Voltron was to me, and at the age of 13 was when I first got in touch with Mark Hamill. I ultimately did move to LA and have worked on animated productions that you may have heard of: Jumanji the Animated Series, Extreme Ghostbusters, and the 2001 run of Invader Zim. But when I was asked to help put together panels for this VoltCon, I went back and revisited some of my other notes, not the map, but my trying to construct a Bible of what seemed to make sense for origins and mythos within the show. And we took that as the starting point, and a number of different things came out in that. I will let you know that Mark Morrell did ask us to embed trivia questions in each of our 3 presentations throughout the weekend. And we are going to have up for grabs buttons that actually have the podcast logo on them. So be watching for those throughout our presentations. And you'll have chances at those. So I'm giving you a heads up.
And I'll get them to you after the panel because I forgot to bring them downstairs.
but just hook up with us and you know what I mean. And you'll get that. Sorry, it's the 3-hour time difference, and my brain is still, it's 3 hours early. But I think I can handle this. So the title I decided to go with on this was From Days of Long Ago or Not, Origins of the Voltron Robots, because depending on which Voltron we're discussing and which era, it can be very different things. Next slide.
Real quick, so Shannon gave a great introduction. If you don't know me, I'm Greg Tyler, co-host of Let's Voltron, the official Voltron podcast. And Mark Morrell, who couldn't be here this weekend, is the host of the podcast. You can find us online at letsvoltron.com. And with that said...
Okay, I appreciate that, Greg. I'm so nervous in my own introduction, I had lost that you hadn't done that in the other part. Okay. So basically, as I was saying, we'll review legends and facts as they're laid out by the storyline that we see in the show. Also pose unanswered questions of what might have been to leave you to ponder, but not going to lean hard to what our own personal conjectures might be on these, just to leave you to think about them. As I wrote down on paper as I was working on some of the stuff, I said, the goal is not to nitpick the inconsistencies, but seek the wonder of possibility. To consider the alternatives for a show that has repeatedly presented the idea of alternate dimensions and universes. And those of you who know Voltron The Third Dimension probably know what I'm alluding to the parting quotes. It's one of the episode titles. And now, let's go back to where it all began. So, now Greg, if you can help me pay attention for this. One of the questions that came up is we wondered, what is the first thing that you and the audience think of when you hear vehicle Voltron? Anybody willing to speak up?
Vehicles, different vehicles. I do remember one episode where they barely mentioned that it was a scientist that created Voltron, but they only made real quick mention of it. I can't remember. And that was it. It's like, well, why? How did they go to build them and why? And they just mentioned the one scientist and that was it. After that, So I remember that much. Well, along with,
Anybody else? First thing that comes to mind when you think of vehicle Voltron?
A larger team, because they had a 15-person team, and the Lions only had a 5-team.
Sounds good. Next slide. Obviously, there's a panel later today that will get into the origin show that vehicle Voltron comes from in more detail. But that comes from Armored Fleet Dairugger 15. Japanese version of the series sets up the ships that make up Dairugger and their starship, which is called the Rugger Guard, as a defensive planetary exploration and defense force looking for new worlds to colonize, as well as mapping the stars. And they're called the Galvestons in Dairugger, are basically doing the same thing and not really wanting to play nice with the Rugger team, which will lead to a lot of infighting. Like I said, if you join us later on today, we'll get into this in more detail. Now, the important part is that according to that series, the robot was not originally intended to be a battle mech and in fact not made for combat, as there are times it's expressed there's little faith it can defeat the enemy. And that version doesn't really give any insight into who even created the robot to begin with. Next slide. Now, if we flip over to what we know as vehicle Voltron for the Defender of the Universe 94. There, as already been mentioned, we think clearly of the super robot that has the 15 vehicles amongst the 3 teams, the air, sea, and the land team. And we got close to it in the front there, Marky, and you're right, that this version was created by a single scientist. It's the only name that's dropped, Dr. Loring, and who we are told took the knowledge with him to his grave in just one episode. So, the beginning credits for these episodes imply that Voltron was inspired by the legend of Voltron, and the pilots are entrusted with the ancient secrets of how to assemble it. This implies that inspiration came from the same legends that our team that makes up the Lion Force already know when they meet Koran, because they show up and they're like, we've heard the legend of Voltron. It's probably the same thing. Next slide. A lot of how vehicle Voltron works is a mystery, and this means it's something the Alliance probably will never be able to fully replicate if they tried. In fact, there's one episode where Commander Steele describes a failed attempt to create another Voltron-like super robot. And I put this on the screen because I wanted to make sure we could get it exactly right. He says, it'll never serve as a replacement for the present Voltron, one they tried to make in the lab. Or even as a backup. I'm sorry to say. The odds of creating another robot like vehicle Voltron are very slim.
And of
Yes,
course,
go
one
ahead.
of the comic books
Which is where we're going.
showing the failed attempt.
So basically the Devil's Due comic from the 2000s pretty much stays.
You might want to click presentation mode, make it larger.
Oh, I thought I was doing that this whole time. Oops. Thank you. Okay.
You guys better over there? Okay,
Thank you.
good. Yeah, with some of the size of the text on a few of these, I'm glad you pointed that out. That was going to work. Basically, the Devil's Due comic from the 2000s stays true to the scientific origins of vehicle Voltron as being built on Earth. They're clearly aware of the legend because this is why Hawkins sends the Lion Force the way the Devil's Due did the comic. Well, the comic was less clear about the inspiration behind the vehicle Voltron. There's some people among the Alliance forces who are willing to be basically in cahoots with the rules to see that things don't go forward with it working as intended. Next slide. Now it's going over to the other robot. So when you hear Lion Voltron, what are the first things that you think of? And don't limit yourself to the iteration on the screen, literally. When you hear Lion Voltron, what is the first thing you think?
Peter Cullen going, in the dark rests of the universe, the opening sequence.
Anybody else?
Yeah, he was originally a single robot, and then a god or something
Space
like that.
goddess.
Yeah, space goddess broke him up. I do remember that. So there's that part. It's like he originally was just one robot, according to that.
It's just looking at the image that you had up there, it just brings to mind my childhood of being, that far away from the screen and trying to absorb everything about the show, because for some unknown reason it spoke to me in ways that nothing else did. It actually changed part of my childhood.
I think a lot of us can probably speak to that as well. That's a great story.
Okay. Now, bear with me, it's a little small for me, so I'm hoping that you guys can read it better than me. Basically, the anime that Lion Voltron comes from is usually known by GoLion for short. Its full title is Beast King GoLion. Set in 1999, like the past for us. It's kind of a running trend in that time period, isn't it? Because Macross was, I don't know, think about it. So, Altea, which sounds familiar because it was later used in Legendary Defender, which is the name of the main planet here, is subdued by the Galra Empire. And 5 Earth explorers return from their latest exploration to find that planet Earth is the one that's totally decimated in a war. So after they get captured by the Galra Empire, they're enslaved, but later make their way to Altea, where they reawaken the giant robot of legend. And I realize now I have more notes on this particular one than I really want to go through and read. But essentially, Rabel is Koransing in that particular show. And he goes through explaining that in GoLion's case, there was a single entity, single robot like we were talking about still, but that single entity and its consciousness, it had a problem with hubris. It was a bit too proud of itself. And the space goddess in GoLion is basically punishing him for that hubris. It's meant as a punishment. And in this telling, that happened 15 years ago is about when everything falls apart and Altea's destruction is ordered. So we have a little better sense of time.
Actually, it was a few thousand years
Okay.
after the space goddess split GoLion, and then there was an invasion of Altea. Then we jump ahead 15 years.
Thank you.
Yep.
Thank you. I was trying to say the same thing, I can't remember. One of the big puzzles I just never really get about GoLion is that the advisor says that the king always carried the keys to the lion versions with him and were in his tomb. Well, in that version, pretty much the entire royal family was well taken care of, shall we say. So if he always had them on him, why didn't they find them? How did they end up where they did?
Good question.
We don't know. That's one of those things I said I drop things as we go. Don't know the answer to that one. Well, Beast King GoLion used the elements as power sources. They also went to more trouble to describe how the lions work scientifically, downplaying the magical fantasy that permeates what we know as Lion Voltron. Basically, how they broke it down was that, and they were very much more precise in how things operated. For example, you'll see them on the screen, I won't read them all. But when black lions provide lightning energy, they're like, it's thunder protons, and here's the horsepower, and we never got into that detail in Lion Voltron. It was just, it's this element, it's this element, it's this element, and we'll talk about here in a minute. But I just wanted everybody to see, for illustrative purposes, the level of detail that Beast King GoLion went into. Thanks, next slide. Even though Beast King GoLion was split as punishment by the space goddess entity, ultimately redemption is received when the space goddess saves GoLion from destruction at the hands of what they call Space Wolf, which we know is the mega comet. And we know this from this translation of her dialogue. GoLion, it's still too soon to give up on everything. You still have a mission to carry out for the sake of the universe. Altea is currently in need of your power. GoLion, use the abilities of your body and harvest infinite energy from this sun. The movements of Space Wolf have already been halted. The immobilized planetoid's hypergravity will soon send it down the path to self-destruction. Before it goes, muster your remaining strength and escape. Come, you must make haste. So the fact that she has been willing to save GoLion says, okay, you made up for all the past stuff that I was punishing you about. I'll help you get out of this. And so she basically, and that happens, she has to also give it the power to do that. And so in the version that we know as Lion Voltron, the legend's very similar. But the focus shifts in the American adaptation more to King Alfor as the one who created the lions. And I'm just putting that in quotes because that's the phrase that gets used over and over. It's implied that Alfor is the one who does the conversion work to make it so they can be piloted after the big breakup, and then hides the keys in his tomb. Even though he's magical, the show makes the point that Eris had some of the most advanced scientists in the entire galaxy, which is interesting, even though at the end of the day they keep going back and crediting it to Alfor, who knows got a rather bit of magic at his disposal. The same legend goes on to explain the existence of the giant robot in the beginning, going back to what we were talking about earlier, in that there was a single giant robot, and that Witch Hagar, pretending to be a space goddess, lured Voltron close and broke him up into 5 parts, each falling down as a robot lion. This removes that through line of punishment and redemption that we saw in GoLion. It's just a trickery that happens. It's nothing that the big robot did wrong to be punished. The legend and the fact that the Castle of Lions held the secret was so well known that Keith even mentions it before they set foot on Eris. So there's one of the lines of dialogue is like, sure is, hunk. And according to the legend, Voltron was the most powerful defender of justice in the far universe. And they know that that's exactly where they're going. And I'm like, interesting. And that raises another one of those questions. If everybody knew that the secret was there, why was there not more effort by the Druids to invade and take the castle? They always seem to be shooting it up. We'll talk more about that someday. But Alfor's daughter and her advisor Coran decide that their planet's only hope is to entrust these strangers to save their world. And so as I mentioned earlier, there's all this emphasis on that Alfor did the conversions on the lions. But we're not as clear on the timeline as GoLion presents everything. It's just kind of nebulous. At least I never figured it out from everything that I've looked at. Thank you. Now, here is that trivia question that I warned you about. Some of you came in later. We are going to have trivia questions in every one of the 3 panels that we're doing together. This was something that Mark set up with us, Morel. And we will be giving away podcast logo buttons. See us later during the con to pick those up. For this one, here's one that some of you might know. Coran explains at their first meeting, meaning the first meeting of himself and the space explorers, that Eris was once known as the most beautiful planet in the galaxy. For those of you familiar with most of the series, that's the Danubian galaxy. That's not what Coran says the first time they meet him. What is the galaxy's name? What does he say?
Natalie, I'm so surprised you know this. Just kidding. What is it? The Diamond Galaxy.
Yes, you had it right there. So yeah, this was kind of one of the reasons, if any of you have ever seen the star map or read the history on it, I started this and then had a long conversation with the late Bill England about it when we were deciding to do the Third Dimension star map. I said, okay, Coran's under a lot of stress. He just had a bunch of strangers on his world. One of the things that hasn't been defined is what are the name of the solar systems? And so that's what I did, and Bill decided to run with it when we merged stuff together, was all the different star systems. That's why they have like diamond star systems, the onyx star system, they're all what we know as Earth, precious jewels and minerals, was to lend some credence to why would Koran make that error? Because there was no other way to fix it. And so that's why we did it.
That's pretty creative. That's cool.
Okay, now here's some of those questions I don't have an answer for, but here it is.
This is not a trivia question.
No, the only trivia question is, they'll be labeled trivia specifically throughout the weekend. But when they first come out in the uniforms, and I had not caught this one. This one actually was one as going back prepping for this panel that I caught. It was in my open notes. They come out in the uniforms for the first time, and Koran says, "Are uniforms in action again?" And I go, "Again? When was the first time?" Literally, it's like, okay, if they're not sure that the Lions have ever flown, and we're not sure if they've ever flown before, who were them? Did he have beta testers that went and died with him in the Valley of Zoar? We'll get to that in a minute. Who were them first? We don't know. Thanks. Sorry. Here, this one I know has a lot of small text on it, but I'll give you the high points. Basically, this is we mentioned the Space Wolf earlier. This is the origin instead of the Omega Comet, which Hagar basically describes as a comet that acts like a black hole, that sucks all kinds of stuff into it. And that Voltron apparently, at some point in the past, removed the comet, hid it in the far corner of the universe, and she locates it and puts it back into play in the universe as well. But what's interesting about that is Koran mentions that when Voltron faced them, there was a highly secret attack plan that was lost. And he also insists it took 10 years to find the first time. And then you've got the goddess who isn't Hagar in disguise that helps them out and saves them here, which happens to look like the one that Hagar was impersonating in the beginning. The big question that comes up here that further confuses the timeline, either that or Koran is a really good scholar, is how long did Voltron exist in this time period as a full robot before becoming the Lions again? Because Koran seems to know a lot of detail about how long it took to find that first attack plan and other things, but the way he says them sounds like it happened in his lifetime. Okay. Again, that's one of those, I don't know. The Space Goddess also gives us the most insight into how Lion Voltron is powered since its creation. Because to heal it, she says, I have to power you with the hope of 1,000 suns, thereby underscoring that solar energy seems to run the combined Voltron. And there have been hints to that elsewhere, and I didn't really want to break all that down into a really detailed slide. But she just, the way her dialogue really hits that on the forehead. And I'm like, okay, cool, thanks. A couple other in the interesting questions department that actually tie back to the vehicle is in one of the episodes, Voltron versus Voltron, where they come up against the version of Voltron made by the Jules, as you see pictured here. There's a reference made that this is an exact duplicate of Voltron, built on stolen blueprints. And to add to all this, there's another episode, Doom Boycotts the Space Olympics, in which Lotor mentions a stolen diagram of fantastic circuitry. Wait a minute. Nobody on Eris seems to have any of this knowledge. This seems to have died with Alfor. What do they have? Do they have Loring's notes that he extrapolated of his theories of how he thought Voltron worked? Where did these blueprints come from? Again, about that, but we don't know category. Okay. And then there's just this interesting one that threw me when I was later down in LA. I had heard that something called The New Adventures of Voltron was showing up. And what had happened was that there was a repackaging of those of you who don't know the history, there were a certain number of episodes that were commissioned originally by what is now known as Web, specifically for the American market. There was an attempt made in 1997. They basically put in new beginning credits, I believe ending credits, a year since I've seen them, and a little CGI added effects, and that's what went back out into syndication. And that's where I've got some of the shots from the opening credits in here. But there's some interesting facts in those 20 episodes that some fill in the blanks with the stuff we've talked about, and some leave it even more questionable. Thanks. Number one, this is the big number one on the list, and I have no answer for this, is Allura and Romel's childhood. There's an episode where Romel is remembering her childhood, and she remembers meeting Allura's dad. And from the original episodes, they'd never seen each other till adulthood because they shocked each other when they met for the first time and they looked exactly alike. So, under what circumstances could Romel have met Alfor but never met Allura? That's interesting. On the right-hand side, you see one of my favorite characters from that set of episodes, named Omnia. And the question above it is, who are the Darians? There's a planet called Zal. And there, it turns out that it's underneath a base where their mining lays on. And she talks about, we're basically rebuilding our lives. And there was an ancient race here. And their name was the Darians. And they disappeared. And we don't know where they went. Well, if they're ancient, and Voltron's ancient, could they have known anything about the original robot? And where did they go? Alfor and Zarkon's final battle, I alluded to the Valley of Zohar earlier. Putting really leads the local people to believe that Alfor will reappear at the Rainbow Caves, where there's a mural of Alfor and his ancient lion warriors fighting Zarkon. This is supposedly the site of his final battle in the Valley of Zohar in the painting. Question, if the lions were already ready at this point, why would Alfor not have had his lion warriors pilot the individual lions or even the combined Voltron against Zarkon at this point? I don't know. And then the Astronauts timeline. There's an episode where Hunk mentions the Astronauts from the old days. Lance adds Wolf Knights, Lions, and Hawk Fighters, and goes on to credit the Lions to Alfor, claiming that's where you got the robot lions, but it's not clear if this is legend or fact. And that's the episode where we also meet Strider Tech. Fleet of Doom has the issue with Hagar splitting into good Hagar and bad Hagar. And it's not clear exactly at what point that happened. It raises this interesting question, was the action of posing as the space goddess to separate Voltron up the act that caused her to fall from grace? Again, we don't know, fun little thing to play with next. Voltron The Third Dimension. Notice the time period here for both Third Dimension and Voltron Force, which we'll talk about as well, are both take place 5 years after the original series. I thought here, some people say, well, they can't both be true. And I would say, well, actually, yeah, they can. Because the thought on continuities is that different dimensions. I mean, if you go all the way back to the two-parter where Koran had, well, it's not really Koran's son, but the imposter sent in that Hagar creates is Koran's son. We're told that the wife and child have been sent safely to another dimension. And so you got those hints back in '84 that multiple variants are possible. So as I said earlier, consider the alternatives and infallible. And that definitely says Legendary Defenders just as well. Third Dimension, 5 years after the defeat and imprisonment of Lotor. This was originally pitched as a direct sequel, like I said. 2 characters have major changes in this timeline. One is Allura, and the other is Hagar, whose name is spelled slightly different and doesn't have the double G's. And here real quick are the differences. Allura is shown training as a child to eventually pilot the Lions, where we know in the original show that she fought hard to even get behind the seat of a Lion. This was not on her personal roadmap. And Hagar was initially good here also, but in an episode there called Dark Heart, she's portrayed as a contemporary of Alfor's, and there's a sense that, who knows, she possibly could have even become a future Queen of Eris at that point, but obviously that's not the way it turned way too much dense stuff. I know the time situation here. But there's next on this too. But there's a lot of deep, rich history. If you're able to look at the third dimension, it is just absolutely fascinating. And I wish I had time to break it down. It almost needs its own panel. And I was gonna say, next year is 25 years of third dimension, so who knows? I make no promises, but next. Biggest thing I loved about it personally was we finally got to see another woman in power in history. The woman you're seeing there on the screen is Queen Ariella. And Third Dimension took the idea that she actually came from another planet, think like Superman coming from Krypton with no known past history, and that she was basically adopted in by lions on Eris, kind of raised her up. She actually built the original Council of Lions. I'm not out for it.
So there were actually 5 organic lions
Yes.
on Eris that rescued and saved and somehow raised Ariella to adulthood.
And we've seen other legends and other cultures like that, whether it's Tarzan, or I can think of one when I was growing up in Japan. One of my favorite stories was Kintaro's Adventures, where the little boy is lost and raised by animals and stuff. This just took it to a different level. And so eventually she's able to channel in and be with the spirits of those lions that then, right, what is it, next screen, that basically passed down. You want to explain that a little better? Looks like you're poising to do that, so go ahead.
No, you go ahead.
No, please.
All right, well, I was just going to say that the spirits of those lions in the intervening years, those lions presumably passed on, and the spirits of those lions actually somehow occupy the robot lions in Voltron. And there's an episode in which the lions are actually destroyed in the third dimension, and not too long after that, the spirits return and regenerate the robot lions and then re-inhabit them again. So that's an interesting twist on the mythos.
Yep. The next slide, I'm gonna point out a couple of things real quick. There are other iterations of the same Voltron that show up in different dimensions. One is they're able to turn into this stealth mode. It's a 1-episode deal, but there's a tie back that's kind of interesting in this. The ruins they go to are the Darkanian peaks, the highest mountain on planet Eris. And we learn the Darkanians came from another universe, and that there's a sword that Allura has that unlocks other dimensions. It kind of made me stop, and I went, Darkanians. And then there's that missing ancient race that I talked about on Zal, the Darians. Interesting, their names are actually very close. It's probably just a fluke. But again, you never know. Different universes, different things. I threw this in here because I know that if Voltron The Third Dimension had done a 3rd season, Voltrex, which is some toy collectors do have it, it's out there on a limited basis, would have been added to the show. I did get to know Mike Young during the run of the show, and we did flirt with the idea that I would at least get to pitch for it, and so he'd given me that little teeny bit of insight, but I don't know what role, if anything, Voltrex would have gone on to play. But again, that's one of those, we should see how it ever might have turned out. Devil's Due version. Actually, Greg, can you jump in at this point? Is that okay?
Wasn't planning to, but sure. Basically, Devil's Due takes an entirely new take on the Voltron story, as Shannon alluded to with Vehicle Voltron. It's an entirely new narrative. A lot of the fans at that time really enjoyed it because it kind of gave a more grown-up perspective to things, a little bit more of a mature story. What's interesting is that they actually find Green Lion and some of the keys, and it sort of parallels what we later see in Legendary Defender, where the future 2nd generation Paladins of Voltron discover the Blue Lion on Earth, where they discover the Green Lion on Eris, which is interesting. And as in the original story, the Black Lion key is found last. Sven, as opposed to his injury and removal from the story for a while in the cartoon, he's actually rejected by the Lions for having some kind of a brain defect. And Allura steps in and takes over as pilot because she's able to bond with the Lions. One thing that's unique to this version of Voltron that would later be echoed very directly in Legendary Defender is that the Lions and pilots have a sort of mystical bond, which is really interesting. But there are very different origin stories for both Voltron and Zarkon. And the idea here is that a group of scientists and priests worked together to create the original Voltron, the lion-based Voltron, to defeat an empress of the first Drool Empire about 1,000 years in the past. And an evil witch used her magic to destroy that robot, a witch named Sarga. And that's all touched on in a miniseries that followed on called Voltron Legend Forged. And then in the last issues of the comic, writer Mark Waid began to establish an origin for Zarkon, which was very unique. He started out as a Drool soldier known as Lowman 77723, and the second part had him ascend into a slightly higher ranked position. Had the comic continued, we probably would have saw him ascend to become Emperor. And then now we're in the Voltron Force. This, like the Third Dimension, was set 5 years after the defeat of Lotor, arguably 5 years after the original animated show. A big change in Voltron Force is the introduction of 3 new cadets, Daniel, Vince, and Larmina. And in the back, Natalie is cosplaying as Larmina today, so that's really, really awesome. The robot is believed to be essentially, even though it looks different in this show, it seems that the main gist of the robot being what it is pretty much like it was in the original series, until they discover that through the powers unlocked by the cadets' VoltComs, especially Vince, the Lions can actually reconfigure themselves so that any of the 5 Lions can become the center and unlock powers that are unique to that configuration of Voltron. And Voltron's history here is actually explained quite differently in this show. There are 5 different planets that worked together at sometime long ago to create Voltron, with different aspects from different planets. Eris brought with it a sense of unity. The mines of Ariel were where the metal that Voltron was forged from originated, and that's where the blacksmith who helped to create Voltron came from. The planet of Balto, Pidge's homeworld, was responsible for Voltron's technology and programming. Humanity, and that kind of nebulous, what is humanity exactly? But humanity was brought to Voltron from Earth, and Voltron's power source or energy came from a 5th planet that never wound up being explored in the series. This is inconsistent with the original show establishing that Alfor created the Lions, but again, this could be an alternate, take on the story. So one might wonder if Voltron Force is indeed a follow-on to the original show. Was this 5th planet some world that might have been from the original show? Was it Vince's home world? We may never know. It is established in an early episode of Voltron Force that the cadet Vince seems to have something in his blood that may tie him to some early beings that may have been involved in Voltron's creation. As I spoke to just a bit ago, Voltron can reconfigure so that any of the 5 Lions can be its center, and different powers are unlocked that are specific to each configuration. We're all familiar with Black Lion as the center, and Voltron having the blazing sword as its big bad weapon of destruction. Red Center Voltron had what were called magma pistols, and that's certainly derived from Red Lion's affinity to fire and lava. Yellow Center had wrecking maces, which seems really consistent with Punk's big brutish nature. Blue Center Voltron had a Titanic trident, which certainly echoes the water-based power source of Blue Lion. And Green Center Voltron had a boomerang shield, which basically was shown in the series as being kind of like a gigantic throwing star, which is very consistent with Pidge having been a descendant of space ninjas. So there you go. And the cadets' VoltComs could enable different abilities in Voltron. So Daniel had the ability to make Voltron flash form. So in mere seconds, Voltron could combine and jump into battle. Daniel could also generally provide a speed boost, which let Voltron fight much more quickly than normal. Larmina had the butt kick boost, which gave Voltron close quarters, hand-to-hand fighting ability, unlocked the blazing katana, and gave it abilities to that would rival a gigantic Bruce Lee. So that was pretty cool. And Vince had the most powers of all, seemingly. We didn't really learn the nature of how Vince got to have this innate capability, but Vince was needed to unlock each of Voltron's new configurations, and Vince could provide a power boost, supercharging Voltron and/or its weapons. And in the penultimate episode of the show, all three cadets employed their boosts at the same time, and we got to see Voltron wreak all kinds of havoc on the Lotor Rubies, which was really cool. I had mentioned VoltCons. What in the world are those things? In Voltron Force, they were sort of the space Swiss Army knife of the Voltron pilots and cadets. They were developed by the Voltron Force during the 5-year gap between the original defeat of Lotor and the start of the show. It was basically a very advanced high-tech gauntlet that was worn on the right wrist and could change into a bracelet form for stealth and sneaking around to different places. It enabled activating each of the lions. It acted essentially as a proxy for the lion key, which was often placed in a receptacle on the underside of the VoltCon. It could generate specialized weapons for each of its wearers, like twin swords for Keith, the battle staff for Larmina, etc. And it acted as a general purpose communicator and computer. It really is very similar in concept to the Bayards from Voltron Legendary Defender, which were, again, they could generate weapons that were specific to their wearer. They could activate different powers and capabilities in the Lions and Voltron. So there is a bit of a parallel there, but the Bayards sure do look cool, don't they? On the other hand, you got to have a free hand to use the Bayard, and you didn't with the VoltCon. Moving on to Voltron Legendary Defender, 10,000 years ago. No, that's not when Rita Repulsa was placed in the space dumpster. Actually, it was about the same time. Alfor created the Lions using a knowledge of alchemy and the ore of a trans-reality comet that had smashed into the planet Dibazal. And during the Lions' first battle, there's a vehicle Voltron. There's a Lion Voltron with a vehicle Voltron head looking in. Hello! Welcome to VoltCon.
This is what Fleet of Doom should have been.
Love it.
That is an unstoppable robot.
Love it. All right. So returning to our story. After Alfor created the Lions, and specifically the Lions, they were first used in battle against a strange creature that emerged from a rift in realities that had been created by the comet's impact on Dibazal. And the Lions somehow communicated telepathically to Alfor that they could combine into a giant robot, and that the robot was called Voltron. So the original Paladins, which included Zarkon, Alfor, Trigel, Blades, and Rignorath, used the Lions to defend the universe and basically do all of the things that established the original legend of Voltron in this continuity. Zarkon and Minerva became increasingly obsessed with a mysterious energy called quintessence, and they tricked the Paladins into opening the rift in realities further, trying to convince them that would ultimately allow them to seal the rift. But it was really a trick so that Voltron could go into the rift and massively overdose Zarkon and Minerva with quintessence, and ultimately they succumb to it and die. During their funeral, actually before the funeral, Alfor actually has to destroy the planet Dibazal to seal the rift. So that's kind of a thing. But at the funeral of Zarkon and Minerva, they return to life, They're altered by quintessence and are twisted and have different voices, and they learn that Alfor has destroyed Dibazal and swear vengeance against Altea and Alfor. So that's when the massive war between the Galra and the Alteans begins. Alfor hides the lions from Zarkon, sealing Black Lion, which Zarkon had piloted inside the Castle of Lions, and sending it and Allura and Karan away from Altea. Zarkon later kills Alfor in battle, and Minerva steals the quintessence of Tribal Blates and Rignorath, and somehow also Alfor. So maybe he was laying there after the battle, and Minerva came along and worked her magic at that point, or Hagar at that point. In the present of the story, by this point, Zarkon and Minerva, now called Hagar, have conquered most of the universe in their pursuit of quintessence. Takashi Shirogane, who nicknamed Shiro, and 4 current or former garrison cadets, Lance, Pidge, Hunk, and Keith. You might know these names. They discover the Blue Lion on Earth, and it transports them to the Castle of Lions, where their arrival awakens Allura and Karan from suspended animation. That's how they look so nice and young 10,000 years later. And over the course of a day or so, Allura helps the arrivals from Earth rediscover the Lions, and the Earthlings become known as the new Paladins of Voltron. Each Lion chooses its original pilot and new pilot and mirrors the quintessence of the pilot. And that is essentially the origin of Voltron from Voltron Legendary Defender. And while the origin of Voltron in that show is outlined in much more detail than we got from any of the other shows, there are some questions we might ask. Where did the 2 trans-reality comets come from? The first one is the one that provided the material that was used to create the Lions, and the second was found and used to create the Syncline Beast, Lotor's gigantic version of Voltron. Are there only 2 of those comets? Are they natural or artificial? What does it mean to move between realities? How are they interconnected? Just things to think about. Why are the Lions lions? Alfor created them, but he also said that they sort of created themselves. So he was sort of the catalyst for their creation. Did he actually specifically want them to be lions, or did that just happen somehow? Alfor just touched on that. Why can the lions combine, and why do they combine into a humanoid robot? Alfor was surprised to discover they had the ability to combine. He didn't give them that capability. They sort of communicated to him that they could do that. Why? There's a mystery there. Is there something about those trans-reality comets that we may never know? Just stuff to think about. And I think that's it. So.
Yeah, it pretty much is. But I wanted to say before we closed out, a couple of thank yous on the origins point of view. One of those would be to Mark Morrell for being so insistent and so much the driving force for the origin of the Voltron podcast, because it's brought many fans together over time, including myself, who had pretty well removed myself from the fandom now. Because when Voltron Force came out, I was actually working at a division of Viacom, and Voltron Force was being aired on Nicktoons, and so I kind of totally ran away from the fandom at that point and lost track of everything for a while. And if it wasn't for Mark and teaming up with you, Greg, wanting to do that show on the Third Dimension, and you tracking me down, I probably wouldn't be sitting here. So I have to give him a ton of props for being part of the driving force for the origin of that show and everything that it's done for me to even be here right now. And secondly, when I've done the podcast a lot, there's somebody I don't really talk about, and that's my younger sister Leslie, who's about 3 years younger than I am. We were both, and still are, fans of the show. Actually, when, because I've talked about it several times on the podcast, how I wrote in world events, and I did that early on. It was actually both of us in the beginning. The idea was actually me for coming up with the characters, and the vision of the White Lion was hers. And I don't really talk about it that way because it's so easy when you're just being talked to, and it's really been your thread in life. I applaud her for taking time as being a wife and mother of 3 kids. She did go on to form the first gem fan community on the internet, which in turn was the place where the concept was discussed that became the very first VoltCon, but GemCon. And if GemCon hadn't happened, Kevin Clark wouldn't have gone there and been inspired to do this. So there's a very much a part of me sitting here right now who's like, I can't say thank you origin-wise without knowing probably my own sister played a little bit of that. Sorry, it's just, it's kind of big for me. And then all of you that I met last year and this year, you are incredible people, and just to take your time out early in the morning in a con to come and hear us talk about some of the things you already know. I appreciate you for showing up. And I just really wanted to say that. And Greg, I know you have a couple of minutes left.
Let's have a quick round of applause for Leslie and for Mark Morrell. And that's it for the Origins presentation. Does anybody have any questions or comments about any of this?
So much information, thank you guys. We love you both, yeah! Yes!
We love you too! All right. Thank you, everyone.
So if you had your choice, is Voltron and or the Lions sentient? Because we've seen both.
So I speculated during one of the episodes of the podcast that you were on, Shannon, that when in GoLion and maybe even in Voltron, because Voltron's sentience in the original show is maybe up for debate, but I sort of like the idea that maybe Voltron had some kind of sentience at some point, and that when it got split, it was effectively killed, and that its physical form remains operational because of the pilots. So, and it sort of returns to a form of life when operated by the pilots, even going back to the original series. I kind of like that idea, as morbid as it might sound, and I don't even know what it means for a 300-foot tall robot to be alive anyway. But that's something I kind of like.
Perhaps that's part of humanity that was brought by Earth in Voltron Force.
That's a very interesting point, yeah. Anything else? All right, thank you very much, everyone.